People are coming on, I see. So was it Ed and then was it you and then Ed, or I see
No.
Council? Go ahead.
And I think we're still waiting on Councillor Campbell.
In terms of, or I'll get the order of arrival.
Oh, in terms of arrival?
Good morning.
Yep. Oh, there we go. There I am. All right. So I see.
Councilor Royal, thank you, Madam Chair.
Got it. Councilor Bach. So I'm just gonna, just in order of, not of arrival, but in order of speaking, I'm gonna do the co-sponsors first, and then Ed, it looks like, and then Councilor Bach so far. Okay. Right. So, whoops, here comes the text messages. Getting them. All right, I know some people have some time crunches, so why don't we start promptly at 10:05? That gives 2 more minutes for other colleagues to get on and anybody else. And then we'll just go from there. We'll probably, to make this as efficient as possible, I'd ask for people, since this is our continued conversation about this, I would ask people kind of use their remarks as opportunities to direct the conversation, not generally to speak about what they think about this. Is that fair? So, okay. And then I really want to get to work in the working session. Let's see now, I have are the panelists all here? Sure. All the panelists are here. We have ACLU, Dr. Okay.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Good morning, Councilor Braden. Let's see, we have the BPD here, right? Superintendent Kevin, Goldrick. BPD
yes, I'm here, Councilor.
Wonderful, thank you. And then we have from National Lawyers Guild and ACLU also here. Okay. To the co-sponsors, were there any other expected speakers or organizations? I know we had the doctors last time, but right now, ACLU, NLG, BPD.
I believe that's it.
That's it? Okay.
I believe so. Councillor Campbell, did you have anybody else? On my end, I think that's it.
All right. All right, then. So let me go ahead and we will go ahead and get started. I think it's just time. Good morning, everyone. I'm City Councilor Lydia Edwards. It's Thursday, November 19th, and we are here today for a virtual working session on Docket 0811, Ordinance restricting the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles. This matter was sponsored by Councilors Ricardo Arroyo and Andrea Campbell and was referred to the committee on June 17th. The committee held a public hearing on this docket on August 10th, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's executive order modifying open meeting laws, we are having this working session on Zoom. This allows us to balance our duty to represent and work for the public with public safety concerns due to the pandemic. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv. It will also be rebroadcast at a later date on Xfinity 8/RCN82/BIOS 964. Quick review. The docket would restrict the use of chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles by law enforcement in the city of Boston during protests, demonstrations, and gatherings. At the hearing on August 10th, the committee heard from Deputy Superintendent Kevin McGoldrick, Bureau of Field Services from the BPD, Superintendent William Ridge, Bureau of Field Reserve Services, BPD, Hassan Hall, Director of Racial Justice Program of ACLU Massachusetts, Dr. Rohini Har, Physicians for Human Rights, and Jeff Durr, National Lawyers Guild. The committee discussed injuries, trauma resulting from these agents, BPD-specific weapons, protocol, and experience with the use of these agents, and eyewitness reports of use of these agents in recent months. Public testimony was heard from individuals who experienced or witnessed the use of crowd control agents in Boston during recent Black Lives Matter protests. Concerns were raised about the ordinance's waiting period and lack of exceptions for exigent circumstances. I'm going to turn it over to the lead sponsors and have, again, my reminder to my colleagues. This is a working session, and so we've already heard generally about this, so let's get to work. As part of your introductory remarks, I would love for you to direct what questions, what concerns you have specifically about this proposed language. We've also, my colleagues who are here today include the co-sponsors, Councillor Arroyo, Councillor Campbell, Councillor Flynn, Councillor Bach, Councillor Braden, and Councillor Janey, myself as the chair. So without further delay, I'm turning it over to Councillor Arroyo and then Councillor Campbell, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just up front, I have a hard stop. Unfortunately, I could not move something that I had at noon, so I have a hard stop at 11:55. But I believe that Councillor Campbell, if we're still ongoing at that time, Councillor Campbell is more than capable of carrying on. In terms of the ordinance itself, I don't think that much has to be said that has already been said in the hearing in August. What I will say is more so about the intent of this, and the intent of the language amendments that we have here are really about focusing the fact that when we talk about kinetic and chemical crowd control agents and kinetic impact projectiles, we understand that they're not, and the word is now deserting me, I'm sorry about this, but they're not focused weapons in the sense that when they're used in a crowd, they're used in a way that doesn't allow them to just hone in on one individual, and that they can, in fact, have been lethal. And so with that in mind, the ordinance and the amendments that we have are really about focusing the language to ensure that we are both codifying the fact that it has to be through a method of de-escalation before you get to using these weapons, that there have to be a warning issued to the crowd because of the nature of crowds. Those crowds can be made up of multiple components, whether that's young, old, feeble, people who are physically disabled. Any number of people can be in a crowd. And if there's one agitator or one issue that the Boston Police Department believe that they have to use these chemical crowd control agents or kinetic impact projectiles on, we understand that there's no way for them to specifically say use tear gas on one person. And so with that, in the way that this is put together, the hope is that we can get a warning issued, that we can have clear delineated steps of de-escalation and when it is appropriate to use these kinds of weapons. I think we have already spoken on the fact that the Geneva Convention bans this in warfare. And so these are already weapons that really we're already understanding that they're at a level of danger to the public, that they should be a weapon of last resort. I don't think that BPD disagrees with us on that. My understanding is that BPD does agree with us on that. And so the goal is really to codify what that means, giving public warnings, how long between warnings, ensuring that the public is afforded the respect of the de-escalation process. And that's really what I think this working session is about, ironing out the language to ensure that we're providing those kinds of protections at a minimum. It is not a ban. It does not stop them from using this, any of these things. It just codifies language to protect the public in the event that they decide to do so. And that's it for me. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, of course, Councillor Arroyo, for the continued partnership on this specific issue. And as Councillor Arroyo stated, we're here to discuss, obviously, the language of the chemical agents ordinance and the amendments that we've also received that will get us to what we think is a balanced and effective and reasonable piece of legislation. In the first hearing, of course, which we held in August, we learned about in some detail the harmful and long-lasting effects of chemical agents and the need for Boston to codify, to write into law a specific and transparent policy that everyone is aware of that will guide how and when we use these weapons. I will say personally, I believe we should ban weapons like tear gas and rubber bullets from ever being used against civilians. But I'm hopeful that we can pass this ordinance in the immediate, work to further demilitarize our police after these regulations are already codified to protect our residents, which of course include police officers, from harm and from injustice at future protests and large-scale events. Again, Councilor Royal, kudos to you and your team. You know, I know my team has been back and forth with your team. We don't do this work alone, so I definitely want to give a shout out to them. And Madam Chair, your team as well for guiding us through the process and through this committee. Thank you for your leadership too. So looking forward to getting into the weeds and getting to work. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards and Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Campbell. I'm here to learn more about this ordinance. Thank you for the panelists that will be testifying today. Thank you to the Boston Police as well. That's all I have. Thank you, Councilor Edwards.
Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the proponents here. I was in the Common trying to help folks find their way home after the T closed on the May 31st protests, and got a little bit of sting from tear gas that had been used sort of wafting down the street. And I was quite far back from where it was used. And I just think that, I mean, to me, things that are, as Councilor Arroyo said, not allowed by the Geneva Convention, it shouldn't be things we're using on a domestic population. So really want to constrain this. Would love to ban it as much as possible. But this is a working session, and I think we should get down to the legislative drafting work. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate this is a working session. We had a very thorough discussion in the summer about this issue. My own preference would be to ban these weapons altogether, but I understand that if we have really clear guidelines for their use as a method of last resort, then that would be good. So let us work on drafting the language, and thank you.
Councillor Janey.
Thank you so much. The sponsors said it best, so I don't need to add to that.
Thank you. Councillor Mejia.
Yes, good morning. And thank you to the makers for bringing this issue to the council. During the protest after the murder of George Floyd, I spent my evening driving into downtown Boston to pick up protesters because the trains were shut down and the police responded to the crowd of peaceful protesters by firing tear gas at them. In terms of how I plan on directing the conversation, my interest will be focused on how to make this ordinance stronger and more accountable. I have some questions regarding the exceptions in the ordinance and hope to get some clear answers from our people who are looking at us and holding us accountable to the changes that we so desperately need. And I am with Councillor Campbell in the sense that I think that we need to just ban this altogether. And I also think as we continue to go down this rabbit hole, we need to think about the social and emotional and traumatic impact of those who have been targeted and impacted by this, and what accountability exists to those folks. And I'm not sure, probably this is not I don't know if this belongs here, but I just think it's something for us to think about, is the social and emotional traumatic impact and the residue of being targeted by this, and the responsibility we have to help support these folks through that journey.
Thank you. Councillor Sabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to be here. I'm part of this working session and look forward to the conversation ahead this morning. Thanks.
And I'll just conclude noting, I appreciate Councillor Arroyo's summary. This is about dispersing methods and the tools and resources that we give, or the standards that we give to the BPD. And so this is I think, a comprehensive conversation with stakeholders at the table to come up with a way that this is going to be implemented. I want to be clear, though, this is strictly for the public. This is strictly about the moments in protest and large gatherings. that these alternative means we're not discussing, for example, with an arrest. We're not talking about individual back and forth, or if there should be alternative non-lethal means used when dealing only with one person or only in one moment. So this is strictly about specifically large gatherings and the standards that we're going to use when this is implemented or not. So I will now turn it over again. We have 3 organizations here represented. We have the National Lawyers Guild, we have the Boston Police Department, and we have the ACLU. I will, as this is impacting the Boston Police Department and their day-to-day, I'd like for them to go ahead and speak to their thoughts, concerns, or suggestions for the language. Then we'll turn it over to the ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild. Deputy Superintendent.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for allowing me to join this conversation. So as we discussed previously, there are some issues with the ordinance that we would like to weigh in on. First of all, some of the way it's laid out initially, I would just like to highlight. I can just go point by point very briefly. So law enforcement in Boston has not used these devices to disperse lawful, peaceful demonstrations. Second point is irrefutably they are safer than firearms. That's kind of a interesting point to put into an ordinance that they're thought to be safer than firearms. They irrefutably are. Prolonged doses to exposure in a crowd controlled setting is extremely unlikely. So I don't think some of the CDC information is particularly relevant to that. The environmental impact, it talks about the impact on the environment of these devices. I would suggest that the environmental impact of burning vehicles and a small forest worth of plywood every time there's a planned demonstration is not particularly beneficial to the environment either. So I think that's minuscule to the point of not really being relevant about the environmental aspect of it. Crowd control tactics are targeted. That would be 0.6 relative to this ordinance. With respect to children and the elderly being particularly vulnerable, they're also vulnerable to unchecked violence in a crowd control setting. As far as the 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibition goes, that was obviously, that seems to be a logical fallacy to me that we're comparing one to another. That authority is not particularly relevant. Obviously, 1925 is in response to the World War I use of that type of gas. That OC wasn't invented till some 50 plus years later. So I don't know if I don't know what relevance that particularly has, but it's an odd thing to put into an ordinance from my perspective. But I just don't see the relevance in that. But to discuss some of the comments from today, from Councilor Royal mentioning kinetic weapons are not aimed at a particular person. They are. The kinetic weapons are aimed at a particular person. People are highly trained not to have a crowd impact on it. I understand the point relative to say OC or CS gas. Relative to his point about the escalation, that's always attempted. We always try dialogue. We always try de-escalation. We've been more specific about including de-escalation into our operational plans, but it's always been and is way more than 90% of the time a successful aspect of what we do, as evidenced by, we sent some data to you about the number of times that these riot control agents are used. And it's an extremely rare occurrence. I can go into detail on that, but I think the documents have been provided. I can ask if you want to ask questions about those. I think that's probably a more efficient use of our time. And to Councilor Bach's comments about banning as much as possible. I mean, we're very judicious and very reluctant to use any of these. And, to me, it's not a choice of, if we ban one tool, then how do we deal with the ramifications of what we fail to prevent? So if we ban an effective tool and violence continues unchecked, what fills that void? Is that void going to be filled by vigilantes, as we've seen in Kenosha? Is violence going to spiral out of control and impact innocent people, as we saw in Charlottesville? I mean, there's another side to this risk. So this ordinance is taking away a proven widely used tool in the US and other developed countries, the EU. A lot of countries use this tool safely and effectively to prevent violence. So there's another side to this equation. What happens when we don't use this tool and we don't prevent this type of violence and it spirals out of control and innocent people are harmed by the violence that ensues? I mean, that's a real risk, and that's something I think needs to be considered. So specific to the restrictions in the ordinance, it discusses two warnings with 2 minutes in between, and call it 30 seconds apiece for the warnings themselves. We're looking at about 5 minutes to wait before we employ proven effective means of crowd control. This is particularly problematic when we have two crowds that are antagonistic towards each other. Are we naive enough to think that in the crowds of thousands of people, nobody is armed? Do we want to allow 5 minutes of unchecked or inefficiently checked violence when we have proven means of controlling that violence? I'd be curious as to what the metrics were that settled upon two warnings and the time in between, and what are the variables. Time is an important variable when we're trying to control violence, and this is what this refers to. This is not something that we employ against peaceful demonstrations. That's just a falsehood that's been put out there. I don't know what other police departments do, but I know what the Boston Police Department does. And these tactics are not used against peaceful protesters. Councilor Mejia mentioned that peaceful protesters were subjected to CS and OC. And I realized she mentioned she was going in to pick people up, so apparently it was not there. That was not the case. I can assure the council that that was not the case. So, it just leads me to question what it is we're trying to prevent. We've shown that this is extremely rarely used as a last resort, as indicated. The council wants this to be a tool of last resort. And I would say the data that we presented to the council shows that it is a tool of last resort. So, I'll just reiterate, and obviously I'm available for questions, but I'll reiterate my point that if we take away an effective, safe tool, what fills that void? That's the problem. That's the risk. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see, Councilor Roy, I do see that you raised your hand. I just want to be kind of direct in terms of the response and summary first for the deputy superintendent. Deputy superintendent, while several of my colleagues mentioned that they would like to remove this altogether, I think Councilor Roy, you made clear at the very beginning, and the ordinance is very clear now, that it is not intended, nor is it written in a way to remove those things. So while I can respect the concerns about yes or no and the overall philosophical debate, this working session is directed to the language and the impact directly in the proposed ordinance. So just to be clear, there is no removing these things.
Okay,
that's all I wanted to make sure that we're on the same page with that.
Okay.
So,
it mentioned, I figured I'd address it while it was.
No, Deputy Superintendent, your overall response, or the BPD's response to this, is what we're seeking. But I want to make sure that when we're talking about in the working session, we're pointed on the language. And so that when you got to the points about the language specifically, and there's the practical reality of how you do your job, that's the facts. Those are facts of you saying that the BPD uses this as a method of last resort and it's judicious when it uses it, and so on and so forth. I want to say there's nothing in this language, nor there's nothing that I heard today, nor do I feel that you are not judicious in using this as a last resort. What I understand, the goals of this ordinance is to be clear about how you come to that decision of it being last resort, how we come to the decision or the process to make sure that people are warned that this is about to happen. And so we got down, and I really appreciate you getting down to the timing, right? You said it's about 5 minutes, and these are conditions that don't make sense for a 5-minute kind of buffer, which is you could have different protests, A side, B side, you could have all these different kinds of things. And so I think what I'd really like to know, and again, apologize, Councilor Roy, if I'm taking too much, but when it comes, is there a warning or procedure or de-escalation kind of movement or process that you are okay with codifying? The BPD, not you. My apologies, not you specifically.
Well, I think it's problematic when you set timelines, particularly timelines here where this ordinance includes no exception whatsoever for defense of others or self-defense. So
Right, so
I
that's
was
one
out
thing.
there.
An exception for defense of others and self-defense.
Yes, so say there are innocent people who somehow got caught up in this violent incident, and certainly we've seen across the country. There's an incident, I'm not sure where it was, but one person was part of a particular group and was set upon, I think it was somewhere on the West Coast, and shot and killed because he was separated from another group, and one group targeted him. So, those types of things unravel fast. But in strictly the crowd control process, when I was out there on Tremont Street and I was there on the 31st, there was a carload as a family in a car that was trying to escape this entire chaos. And, if those people are caught up in people wanting to burn cars and create damage and hurt people with young kids in that car, we need effective tools in order to extricate people from that situation. Would it be wise to tell them to park their car and wait 5 minutes until we can employ OC, or do we have a judicious use of OC? Let's say some officer, not even, we tend to talk about these billowing smoke clouds of OC and CS gas. That's typically not what it is. It's typically an officer with his personally issued can of OC that can effectively have a crowd move away, and we can get people out of there. And I would just point out one other thing, that this is not, the way it's written is not specific to demonstrations. It's 10 people or more. And, unfortunately, I've been at very large bar fights and house parties where people are intoxicated and people are being violently assaulted. OC is a very effective way of stopping that kind of harm when you only have 2 or 3 police officers there, and saving people from being beaten or otherwise threatened with harm. And it can involve more than 10 people. So that language is also problematic for me. But primarily the lack of exception, the lack of very experienced, well-trained officers to apply their judgment to a situation, I think is problematic. I think to legislate specifics with no exception, it creates kind of a usurping of the judgment and experience of the officers on the street, who I would say are probably about as well-trained as any you will find in the country. And I think our record shows that.
Very well. So just to summarize and make sure I'm clear, we have, there's a concern about an exception to the rule or exception to the moment with self-defense or defense of others. There's a concern specifically about the size mentioned in there, 10 or more people or 10 folks. And there's a genuine concern about codifying discretion, which, as I'm hearing from you, it is case by case, moment by moment, and training kicking in, and to try to predict all of that, right? And put it in an ordinance where there's a 1, 2, 3 or some sort of robotic understanding or whatever it is, seems to take away from the discretion of the officers who are trained, as you stated, for
Yes.
this particular moment in time. So overall, and I just want to make sure, because I know the lead sponsors want to ask questions, people want to ask questions. Overall, I understand BPD does not support this ordinance for those overall reasons, right?
That's correct. Yeah. And the other reason, relative to that, there's defined training for crowd control situations to prevent this type of violence that we've seen elsewhere, and we've been effective at it. We also have partners that come into the city, many of them who very graciously, at the expense of other municipalities and of course the state police, help us out as well. They're trained very specifically also. So this kind of intervenes in the process of controlling violent crowds and adds sort of an artificiality to how it's done. I can't be sure what the reaction will be from some of our voluntary partner organizations that help us out. If they are going to have to deviate from their training, what liability, what risk are they incurring by using now a non-standard approach to crowd control because of an ordinance. And they are also obviously subject to found to have done something that is illegal and in violation of an ordinance when they were acting in good faith relative to their training and crowd control tactics. So that's another concern, kind of supplementing an ordinance for training, experience, and judgment.
Thank you very much, Superintendent. So what I'm going to do now is, and I see Jeff, you raised your hand, but I'm going to go through the counselors first for their questions specifically. This kicking off with the co-sponsors, and then before we have other invited guests ask questions of the police, I do think it's important that the National Lawyers Guild and the ACLU present their positions and suggestions on the language before. So we know, Jeff, if people are just tuning in, they don't know who you are, what you stand for. So before you go ask the questions, that's all. So in order of arrival, we're starting off with the co-sponsors. And again, I'm going to encourage, push, and move you to get to the questions. Love politicians, we like to talk a lot, but we're going to move. And so I will put you on a timer. We're going to start with 3 minutes. So Councilor Arroyo, feel free.
Thank you, Chair. And is it Deputy McGoldrick? I just want to make sure I give you your proper title.
That's correct. Yeah, Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick.
Okay, Deputy Superintendent. In terms of just that, I want to clarify a couple things because I think it's important to understand for the basis of this language. The word I was looking for was indiscriminate. And I know that the argument is that you can discriminately use kinetic impact projectiles or chemical crowd control agents, but in the city of Boston, we know that kinetic impact projectiles have taken life. We lost Victoria Snellgrove to kinetic impact projectiles, and I would assume it wasn't intentional. And so when we talk about kinetic impact projectiles or chemical crowd control agents having a physical impact and possibly leading to death and injury, we know that when tear gas canisters hit people physically, which they do, they can shatter orbital bones, they can cause real injuries that are severe and life-altering. And so nobody is saying that that's exactly the same as firing a firearm into a crowd. But what we are saying is that the impact can lead to the same thing. It can lead to a death. It can lead to a severe life-changing injury. And I just want to be clear, you're not disputing that a tear gas canister can cause severe debilitating injury if it hits a person directly, or that a tear gas chemicals themselves can cause negative health reactions, or that kinetic impact projectiles, if they strike somebody in the wrong place, can actually end a life. You're not disputing any of that.
No, certainly we look at those risks and we weigh those risks. That's why we rarely use these tactics. And in my 30 years in the department, I've seen these tactics used one night.
So I think we can both agree that these things can have life-altering consequences for an individual that could lead up to even taking their life, that they deserve. Because I'm with my colleagues in that I believe we could pass a full ban. I don't think we could. And that's why we have what we have here. And so if we're doing this, which is a restriction, the reason for that is I think that anything that can indiscriminately cause death or cause severe permanent injury should be off the table. But because it's not off the table, I believe that anything that can cause death or severe injury should have the highest, strictest protocols to be used. And so when we're talking about that, when we talk about OC spray or tear gas or kinetic impact projectiles being fired into a crowd to disperse a crowd, that's not an orderly dispersal. And I don't think anybody would call it an orderly dispersal, and that itself could lead to more injuries. But as we talk about this specifically with the warning portion of this, with the timing for the warning, the reason that, I think you said 5 minutes because it's 2 minutes and 2 minutes. The reason for that is if the goal is to have a dispersal, if the goal is to have a cessation of activities, they should be entitled to be told, these are the things that are going to be done if you do not disperse, so that people who hear that can say, I don't want that to happen to me, and they can disperse if they so make the decision to do so, and they are taken out of harm's way, and they are given an opportunity to leave harm's way. And I don't think 2 minutes is too much time for somebody to leave that setting. I'd note there are exceptions, and we can get to that when we get there. I know there's a 3-minute timer on me, so we can get to that when we get there.
As co-sponsor, I'm going to give you a little flexibility. I know you have a hard stop, so you could just go ahead and go through your points, Councilor
Thank you.
Arroyo.
And so I know that there's exceptions built into this, but I think if the goal is to stop ongoing, negative behavior, there should be a de-escalation process. And that de-escalation process should at a minimum begin with a warning, should at a minimum begin with giving people an opportunity to stop what they're doing.
There is, that exists currently in our policies. That currently exists.
So then I don't understand the issue with codifying it. I guess I'm
Codifying
confused
a
as to
time-
what the issue is. If it's already something that
Time frame
BPD.
without exceptions.
So I guess the question is, there's a way where you can create enough exceptions that the warning is rendered meaningless. And so in terms of giving warnings, in terms of ensuring the protection of constituents, that's the focus here, because I can't ban it. I don't think I have the ability to do that here. And so if I know and own that and accept that and know that this is not doing that, at a minimum, I would like to give residents of the city of Boston the ability to know that anything that can be used lethally and indiscriminately is not going to be used with no warning, without the ability for them to disperse, without some kinds of checks and balances. And I understand that there's, that the BPD has their own internal, I guess, guidance or guidelines on this with exceptions built into it. But this is to create just a standard language to do this. And I think I'm going to cede the rest of this moment so that we can get to my co-sponsor and also the other speakers. And then, I'd like to just see that conversation flow. But I think I've made the intent clear. And I think I've made the intent clear in the sense that this is very limited as to what it's able to do. And I'm sorry for that. But it's also what I think is the most important thing we can do, which is protect our constituents in the instance where we can't completely ban this. And so that's it for me. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you would like to respond, Superintendent, or if we could go ahead.
Just briefly. So the question remains: if somebody is at risk, whether it's defense of others or a police officer at risk of violence from a crowd, which can be significant, we still have people out injured from May 31st. Some people with significant injuries caused by explosives, and we've had cars burned. A lot of issues that were clearly in the range of what I would consider significant violence. When we remove the ability for them to even take a can of pepper spray off of their belt and spray it at a crowd of people throwing frozen water bottles and the crowd throwing their own cans of CS gas. An interesting note for that night is people in the crowd used CS gas well before the police did. So how do we respond to that? There's a question of what fills this void, and I haven't heard anybody relay any information to how we are going to change our tactics to be effective at controlling crowd violence. There is that side of crowd violence that will also cause trauma, will also cause injury, will also impact residents of the city. This is a proven method of dealing with violent crowds, and I'm still curious as to what we are going to use to fill that void.
Councilor Campbell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as a co-sponsor, I lift up, what Councilor Arroyo has said, in that this, we have been intentional in striking a balance here, understanding what the Deputy Superintendent is talking about. And we had a long conversation in August about this, and frankly, don't want to take 2 hours and waste time talking about the same thing. What has been disappointing is that when we sent the language, we have not received anything from BPD or the administration with specific redlined changes to the language. If the 2 minutes was too long, we asked what's reasonable. And so if the position is BPD is just not for this ordinance, fine, then say that so that we can then move on. So that was, I don't have any questions. I hear what the Deputy Superintendent is saying. We talked about the importance of striking a balance at our initial hearing. We talked about the importance of striking this balance when we were co-drafting this legislation. Councilor Roy and I went back and forth on total ban versus partial ban, et cetera. So at this point, what we're looking for is specific changes to the ordinance language or a firm position by the administration and BPD that they're not for this, which is fine too. We're not going to agree on everything. Madam Chair, through you though, I do think it's important, and maybe if my colleagues are okay with this, that we allow Rasan and Jeff to weigh in now so that we can hear the full range of perspectives and then be able to ask questions to all of them, because I do think that offers information that may be useful in us doing our Q&A.
Happy to do that. I did want to make sure the co-sponsors, however, with a time limit, got to ask their questions. So that was the priority at the time.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. And my goal is to move this along as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
So let's see, in terms of Councillor Flinnbach, Braden, Janey, Mejia, Sabi George, unless I see a blue hand in protest, I think I'm inclined to follow Councillor Campbell's advice. Okey-doke. And we will go ahead and allow for the other panelists to speak today. We'll go ahead and start with my apologies, with Rasan Hall from the ACLU, and then Jeff Fleur from the National Lawyers Guild.
Madam Chair, if it's okay with you, I think I'd like to defer to Jeff, since there was something that he was trying to get in to, so he can just go and then I can follow after him.
Not a problem at all. And
Great,
Jeff, before I know you had responses to the BPD, could you just talk a little bit about, again, who you are, the goals that you have and your position overall, and then whatever pointed questions you have after.
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Jeff Foyer. I'm an attorney in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm also on the board of directors of the National Lawyers Guild, which is an organization of lawyers and legal workers and law students, a national organization, a recognized bar organization by the state of Massachusetts. And we train and provide neutral legal observers for political demonstrations in Massachusetts. So we have had trained legal observers who are supervised by attorneys at every major political demonstration that has occurred in Boston since at least 2010. We've been doing it sporadically before then, but since then we've had observers at every major demonstration. And so part of what the legal observers are trained to do is to observe police behavior and crowd behavior at these political demonstrations. And as a result of that, particularly what occurred on May 29th and May 31st of this year in response to the murder of George Floyd, we've had reports from our legal observers as to the effect of the use of chemical crowd control weapons and kinetic impact projectiles. And I wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick talked about the fact that he has a long history with the BPD in which they have not used these weapons. And now he says, but we have to have those weapons in order to prevent violence by crowds. Well, that's a contradiction. If there is no need for these weapons to be used in the 30 or 35 years that he's been on the force, then why do we have to have them for the 1 or 2 times where something has occurred throughout his entire career? The city council should have letters, 2 letters, one from Physicians for Human Rights and a second one from a combined letter from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights, and Human Rights First, who are among the world's leading independent organizations dedicated to advancing human rights. Both of those letters document many, many instances of severe injuries, death, that have occurred at political demonstrations to people who were not engaged in any sort of illegal, violent property destruction activities of any kind. So it's not, I understand Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick's experience here in Boston over his career, but this is evidence from around the United States with independent organizations documenting that these weapons are indiscriminate, that they do cause damage to bystanders, to people who are engaged in protected constitutional activity of protest. And with regard to a couple of the exceptions, a couple of the concerns that Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick raised, first of all, he said there was, one more fact I want to deal with. He said that there was CS gas being used by protesters in Boston. The National Lawyers Guild also provides pro bono representation to people who are arrested at political demonstrations. Nobody has been arrested or charged with the use of CS gas as a result of any demonstration in Boston that has taken place, period. That has not occurred. We would have been the lawyers who defended people who got arrested there. That has not occurred. So maybe there was use of it, maybe, but we have no evidence of that the police arrested anyone for doing that. The purpose of this ordinance is to put some guidelines into place and to codify the use of these weapons. Now, let me say that Massachusetts already has guidelines in place for restricting the use of these weapons. These are guidelines that have been in place for quite some time. The guidelines are the Department of Correction Code of Massachusetts regulations. So there are strict guidelines on the use of weapons like this against prisoners. But there are no restrictions, no guidelines, no regulations, no ordinances against the use of these kinds of weapons on plain, ordinary citizens out in the street. So we are providing more protection to people in prison for crimes who have been convicted of crimes than we are to regular citizens out on the street exercising constitutionally protected rights. The guidelines under the Department of Correction say that before the use of chemical weapons, the medical director of the prison shall review the inmate's medical file to determine if any medical contraindications exist in using chemical weapons. It says that inmates in adjacent cells shall also be checked for contraindication. The Department of Correction and the state understand how dangerous these weapons are. The police cannot check for the medical problems of people in crowds who are exercising their constitutional rights. There's also a regulation that the use of these chemical weapons must be authorized by the superintendent. Not just any officer, correction officer can use them at their own discretion, despite the fact that the regulations also require specific training of correction officers in the use of chemical weapons like this. So they're trained in it just like police officers are. They have to use discretion when they're faced with emergency situations, just like police officers are. But the superintendent of this prison has to authorize this. That's not true with the police department. Any individual officer can use their discretion for this, to use weapons that are clearly documented as being indiscriminate, including the kinetic impact projectiles. And there are other restrictions as well that the Department of Corrections has to protect people in prison from the horrible effects, the lethal, injurious effects of these weapons. The deputy superintendent also talks about the fact that there's no exception here for defense of others or self-defense, and that's just not true. In the proposed ordinance in section C 3, which are the exceptions and exemptions, it says that an ongoing supervisor at the rank of deputy superintendent, which is even lower than the superintendent of a prison, can specifically authorize such use of these weapons in response to specific ongoing acts of violence or destruction of property that the supervisor witnessed and has determined cannot be controlled or quelled through any other means. So there is an exception for the use of these weapons to defend them others or for self-defense. It's plainly in there. What we're talking about is putting the same kinds of protections on the use of these weapons against large crowds of people who may contain some people who are engaging in illegal acts or acts of violence, and large numbers of people who are not doing that. And to use weapons that, as Councillor Arroyo described, are indiscriminate and have an effect on innocent people engaged in constitutionally protected activity. They allowing police officers to use their own individual discretion in controlling crowds like this is not something that the Department of Corrections allows to be used on crowds of prisoners. It has to be done under the direct orders and supervision of the superintendent or a higher officer. And that's exactly what this ordinance says, is that this needs to be done under the supervision of a deputy superintendent or higher, and as a method of last resort, which is also in the Department of Corrections regulations. And again, I think Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick said, this is clear that they have not needed to use them. Well, if they have not needed to use them, then there should be no objection to having some strict guidelines as to when they can be used. And the fact that we have good officers now who have not used them, and that we have a good superintendent who's not used them, doesn't mean that things can't change. There's a big difference, for example, in our country between how the country behaved under President Obama and how they behaved under President Trump. Things can change. So if we get a superintendent in who does not share the philosophy of the current superintendent, if we get a deputy superintendent in who does not share the philosophy of Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick, there need to be some strict guidelines that will prohibit the complete indiscriminate discretionary use of these weapons by individual officers whenever they feel like they are being threatened or that they can't control a situation. There needs to be some strict guidelines, again, about de-escalation and about giving warnings in order to protect the vast majority of protesters and demonstrators who are engaged in what are constitutionally protected rights to protest, to free speech, to free assembly, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. And I think that's what the ordinance is designed to do. It is not a ban in any way for using these weapons. It is merely to have some strict guidelines that are right in line with the guidelines that are used to protect prisoners in Massachusetts. Thank you.
So I would just say briefly that the ability of a deputy superintendent to authorize protection of others or defense of self is not an exception that actually allows for protection of people who are in danger. The odds of a deputy superintendent being in the right place at the right time to exercise that authority and allow that exception to be implemented is fairly remote. So it's not a sufficient exception. And I'd also say that in the correction setting, that those are probably certainly reasonable protections, but unlike in a crowd control situation, prisoners in a Department of Correction facility don't have the ability to move away from the effects of, say, pepper spray, where in a crowd control situation, they can certainly leave.
We've heard from council members who say they had the effects of tear gas on them, even though they were there just to help people get out of the situation. So this is an indiscriminate weapon. You cannot target it and you cannot limit it. And if people are not given a warning and an opportunity to leave, they will be affected by these weapons. And we have reports from physician after physician of the dangers of these weapons being used on people who have medical conditions, on young children, on the elderly, on people with respiratory conditions, people who may be suffering the after effects of COVID-19 now. There are many reasons why innocent people will be harmed by the use of these weapons.
And then the question still remains, what fills that void then? What fills the void of the impacts of a violent crowd that does not want to disperse? Yeah, I mean, you obviously admit that there are some elements of crowds that sometimes are violent, and we're trying to protect the people who are not violent. How is that going to be done when these tools, and as you mentioned, we've only used them a very limited number of times, but that's not dispositive that they are not needed. The reality is that these tools are needed in very limited circumstances, and they use very judiciously. So I just don't see how that argument translates to the fact that we shouldn't have them when they are crucially needed to protect lives. And we do see the effects around the country, and including death, when crowds are not controlled when violence erupts. We need to control the violence some way. This is a tried and true process, and it's a process that has minimal risk. It's not without risk, but the risk of allowing crowds to continue unabated with violent actions is certainly a risk that we can't ignore.
What fills the void is all of the techniques, de-escalation techniques, and all of the other techniques that the Boston police have used successfully over the last 35 years, so that they have not needed to use these weapons. As you said, we have had violent demonstrations here where these weapons have not been used. You yourself say they are used very infrequently, and you have been successful in controlling demonstrations in Boston, including demonstrations in which 5,000 counter demonstrators have shown up to fight against or protest against a white supremacist group or a Nazi-oriented group. And you've been successful in controlling those crowds and in controlling violence and in preventing property destruction or anything else. Those are the techniques that you can use.
Which we do.
There's no void to be filled because you have been successful in doing that. You have not needed to use these weapons.
We would not have been successful without these weapons on May 31st of controlling the violence. That's a fact. We would not have been successful in controlling the violence as quickly as we were able to. And I think we saw the results in other parts of the country where they were not able to do so. So, unfortunately, we had to use these one time in my career. I hope it goes another 30 plus years before they're used again. And that does not mean that they are not necessary to have as an option when crowds become particularly violent.
No one's taking that option away. This ordinance does not take that option away any more than the DOC regulations takes that option away in prisons. This ordinance merely puts reasonable restrictions on it to protect the other people in the demonstration who are not acting in an illegal or destructive or violent manner. And that's the vast majority of the people who are involved in the demonstrations, even on May 31st.
And those are the people we're trying to protect as well. So, you know, it's not that this isn't a one-sided issue. The other issue is who protects people from the crowds. Sometimes it's not just going to be a crowd that's angry and against the police. Sometimes it could be a crowd against another crowd. And how is that going to be resolved without actions that can be force multipliers for the effects of the police? You know, if there are thousands of people on both sides of a particular geographical area and they're against each other's perspectives and they become violent, we need effective tools to prevent violence. We've fortunately not seen the effects of that type of violence in Boston. I'd prefer to learn from the lessons of other places where they realized that they were ineffective at dealing with crowd violence and had to adjust their tactics. I'd rather stick with what we have used that has worked, which is, of course, dialogue, de-escalation, very successfully interacting with crowds, and in the very, very rare circumstances where we need to use crowd control techniques that include kinetic weapons, OC, or CS gas, and that extremely limited number of times that we've had to use those, I think they should be able to be used, and I think there should be restrictions that are not unduly restrictive, that do not in fact limit the police officer's ability to judge when someone is at risk individually. Even a captain out there with a group of officers cannot make the determination to even use his individual can of OC spray under these rules if someone is being violently assaulted. I find that problematic.
The last thing I want to say is I would go back to what Councillor Campbell said, which is that you have not offered any kind of constructive language changes. All you have said, Deputy Superintendent, is that we shouldn't have this ordinance. And as Councillor Campbell pointed out, if you have constructive ideas about how the language in this ordinance can be modified, I'm sure the council would be interested in hearing that. But what you have said is, no, we don't want this ordinance.
That's correct. We don't want this ordinance because we already have restrictions in place that accomplish exactly what this ordinance is trying to accomplish, and our track record and the data that we provided prove that.
So thank you very much. I think that's it's somewhat disappointing because we would love nothing more than to work through something together to come up with a policy that we can all be part of and directing. But what it looks like is that we're ending we're coming to head essentially. And what that means is that the council very likely will just push through something that it wants to get done over the BPD, which is not ideal. So what I would hope again, and I'm asking, imploring of the BPD, with your legal department, with within yourself, with the mayor's office, whomever it is, could you come up independent of this policy? Independent of this one, if you can't look at this one, can you come up with something that codifies the crowd control methods, the non-lethal methods, you hear our goals. It's a warning, it's protecting the safety. You also have your own discretion, the defense. Could you come up with something, even if you don't write a full-on ordinance, if you came up with 4 or 5 bullet points that we could support something that does this? I would put it back on you because what I'm seeing in the experience, I've been here, what I'm hearing from my colleagues is something will be put before them and they could vote it without you. And that is not ideal. As chair of government ops, that's not ideal for me. It's not ideal for the council. So I'm putting it back to say that and part of this process is neither side gets everything that they want. But the point of the process is that you could have something better than what is before you.
Certainly, always willing to work with the council and everyone, including, obviously the Office of the Police Commissioner and the legal office here, would certainly look to continue the dialogue. We're not opposed to much of the results of what this ordinance would have, because we already do the vast majority of that. And I think that's clear. And I think the data that we have showed the council in preparation for this shows our willingness to use every possible effort prior to using these weapons. As a deputy superintendent out there, the last thing I want to do is authorize use of these weapons, because I know the liability and the risks that incur. And I know that's a challenge that we will eventually look at in terms of public relations with our community. We do not take this lightly. We frankly don't need an ordinance to tell us not to do this. We don't want to do it. It's a situation where we're looking at curtailing violence that needs to be curtailed. And I wish there was a magic wand that we could wave, or some other tactic with no risk, no liability, no discomfort, no harm. But the reality is, these are the tactics that work. These are the tactics that are trained. And without these, I just don't know, if you have a crowd committed to violence, what fills that void? I just, every time I look at this, that's what I come back to.
Right. And I appreciate that. I guess what I'm trying to do is indicate to you that there's going to be a vote on this. So it could be over you, or it could be with you, with your input. So that I want to signal that. And also that this is an opportunity to, and I want to just emphasize again what Jeff said from the NLG. Your discretion, your goodwill, the current administration's discretion, the current administration's goodwill are all noted. The ordinance is to codify so that when we don't have an administration with that goodwill, when we don't have a superintendent with your perspective, that's what laws exist for. It's for the moments. That's why we have civil liberty laws, so on and so forth. It's not when government is working well, it's when government is discriminating or hurting or causing pain, that people have something there to protect them. That's the point. So no one's saying you're not doing a good job, or some people are. Some people are. Fine. This ordinance doesn't. This ordinance does not. The question is when it's not you. The question is when you're gone, moved on, retired, living in Florida, I don't know, wherever you're going to go. The question is for us and the legacy that we set with the circumstances that have surrounded at this moment, our world has changed. Pandemic, George Floyd, our world has changed. What are we going to leave as a legacy? Hopefully with you, to make sure that despite what happens around us, we have the civil liberties, the protections, and the safety of Boston residents, number one, and the discretion and the ability for police officers equally up there to make sure that we are safe. I'd like to be able to do that with you.
And those shared goals, certainly every police officer in Boston that I work with shares those goals. And the reality is
when they're not there, superintendent, when those good guys and girls or women, good men and women are not there, that's what this is about.
I understand. Yeah, I understand the perspective.
Councilor Arroyo, I know you raised your hand again. I think if it's okay, I know you're on a time crunch, if we could hear from Rasan Hall. Or Rasan, I don't know if you had something to add to this moment.
I do. Thank you.
Okay. So Councilor Arroyo, we'll go to Rasan and then we can, okay, thank you very much. Councilor Rasan.
Thank you so much. And I just want to reiterate your last point, Madam Chair, about what is in place in the absence of the people with the goodwill and the good reputation and the history of good work. And to the extent that there are internal policies within the BPD that govern this, that's what should be put forward to be codified within this ordinance. Certainly the ACLU would take it a step further in 3A1, We would want it to be that the deputy superintendent personally witnessed specific acts of violence or destruction of property that creates an imminent risk of death or serious bodily injury. We would insert a subparagraph 3A2 that would indicate that there is no risk to anyone other than the people engaged in the acts described above that would be impacted by the deployment of kinetic impact projectiles or chemical crowd control agents, and where impacted includes but is not limited to the direct effects of these items or their indirect effects by creating a panic or other dangerous conditions in a crowd. And I can submit all this to you all as well. We would create a 3AC, 3A sub 3, that the on-scene supervisor witness specifically authorizes the use only in response to these acts. We would insert a new sub category 4, that the on-scene supervisor witness first requires officers to exhaust all reasonable alternative means of de-escalation, which includes but is not limited to requiring officers whose presence may be causing any escalation to retreat, making individual investigations or arrests of the alleged perpetrators or acts of violence or destruction of property that create the imminent risk of death or serious bodily injury, and otherwise isolating the person or persons who are engaging in the conduct that is creating the imminent risk of death or serious bodily injury. And what is currently 3A sub 2, we would make that now 3A sub 5, that the on-scene supervisor witness gives at least 4 separate warnings over a loudspeaker system that can be heard by all in the area that may be affected by the possible use of force, and directing persons involved in the gathering to disperse, that a failure to disperse may result in the use of the specific kinetic impact projectile or chemical crowd control agent that will be used, and that the specific kinetic impact projectile chemical crowd control agent will be deployed within a clearly defined period of time, and that the warning must be at least, these 4 warnings must be at least 2 minutes apart, and that there must be at least 2 minutes after the final warning has been fully read before any of these kinetic impact or chemical crowd control agents are used. I think it's also important to consider another de-escalation in the process of de-escalation and determining whether to deploy the agents, ensuring that the people have a way to exit after the warnings have been issued, and making sure that other law enforcement officers that operate with BPD, other agencies that operate with BPD, not only know about these restrictions, but are subjected to these restrictions. It's also important to affirmatively post the reports of the violations rather than just saying that they're subject to public records. I think if there are other agencies that are present at the request or under the authority of BPD, that should be clear as well. And then finally, making, and I guess I just underscore the importance of taking individualized steps to address the allegedly violent behavior by the specific individuals before using these weapons. You know, even if these weapons are deployed, they should be used only in response to pervasive and violent behavior or an imminent threat of pervasive violence, and must be used in a manner to avoid or minimize any impact on the people who are not engaged in the violence. So I'll stop there. I can, again, share this in writing, or we can hash it out now as this is a working session. But I think those are key points. But again, going back to Madam Chair, your point is, if BPD is doing well with this now, make the recommendations and proposals that codify it for who we're going to have to deal with in the future, so that we don't have to rely on the goodwill of the folks who may no longer be there.
Thank you. Thank you, Rasan. I wanted to now kind of open it up so that we can have a comprehensive conversation. I do want to note, or do ask of Rasan and Jeff, if there is a policy in the nation of crowd control and whatever that you have found that you find ideal. What would be helpful for me is if you found it that, I don't know, a city of ABCD in blah, blah, blah state has this policy. The first thing I would do is probably call the city or the police there too. But I think that would be also ideal, because I think one thing about if it's unchartered anywhere, which I'm not afraid of, I'm not afraid of that. I do think if there has been charted somewhere and there's some positives and negatives, or some things that they have learned and lessons that we can have, I would love that too. So I don't know if either one of you have a city.
Well, there are two, in response, there are two things I can point to. I believe the Minneapolis City Council voted to actually ban the use of chemical crowd control weapons like this. There's a complete ban on them.
Okay.
In addition to which, the ordinance that Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Campbell are proposing is based upon a federal court order in Denver, again, for restricting the use of this. And basically the ordinance is built around that federal court order to the police in Denver to restrict the use of this in order to protect people's rights. After a full hearing, that's what the court ordered. So this is happening, but this is a fairly new movement in the United States, as more and more information was gathered by people like Physicians for Human Rights as to the effect of these weapons to protect people who are engaged in constitutionally protected activities like free speech and free assembly. So those are the two that I know of. Maybe Rasan has further information, but I know that the court order in Denver, which
When was the court order?
When was it?
Mm-hmm.
It was in, it was either in, it was before May, it was in June, I believe, June of this year.
This year. Okay,
Right.
so we may not have that much data, honestly.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the city council in Minneapolis was sometime this summer.
This year. Yeah. Okay. So sorry, without further ado, to the co-sponsors, if it's okay, I'd like to go in order of arrival, allowing for colleagues to ask questions. Or did either one of you need to prioritize a specific question, Councilor Campbell or Councilor Arroyo? No?
I had one.
Okay, go ahead, Councilor Arroyo, then we're gonna go to Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just Seattle, I believe, did, in terms of Jeff or Mr. Hall, Rasan Hall, Seattle, did they do a complete ban this year as well?
While they're checking, Councilor Arroyo, is that your only
I'm not
question?
sure. I can check it in a moment.
So one thing I will say here, because I do want to get right to the language, is, you know, everything that you have said, Madam Chair, for the most part, about wanting to do this in a way that's collaborative, but also with the intent and the goals that we've stated, I think is true. But what I would say is I don't believe it's a good defense to say, look at what's happening in other cities with, crowd control. They are using tear gas in those cities. They are using kinetic impact projectiles in those cities. And that's the result we've seen. So to say this is what prevents that when it's not preventing that there seems like a falsehood to me. It doesn't seem like something that actually adds up. Because I think in every single one of those places, what we've seen is the use of tear gas, the use of that. And I also just want to be on record as saying, when I crafted this, and I stand by this, I don't consider personal property more valuable than human life. And so when we're talking about, we need tear gas or we need kinetic impact projectiles because somebody's breaking a window or somebody is breaking a car or whatever that may be, I recognize that that is illegal activity that I do not want to see. But I also recognize that something that could fatally strike that person or something that could end that person's life or disable them forever is not a equitable use of force, right? It's not the correct method to address that. And so, I understand the idea of violence and violent crowds. I don't think I've ever seen a crowd that's set on violence in the city of Boston that was set on causing violence and causing true violence to citizenry. But be that as it may, I think that the questions and the things that we're trying to handle here are really around centering warnings, centering space for people to disperse, centering de-escalation, and ensuring that something that can have a fatal impact on somebody is only a decision made by the upper echelons of leadership on the scene. And so, that's it for me. I think we can go to the council if that's what you want to do next, to just kind of go through their thoughts and concerns and questions about the language or whatever.
I would just add that, kinetic impact weapons are not used on people strictly causing property damage. That doesn't happen.
No, I never said strictly. I just said I wouldn't agree with it used on them in those situations.
No, would I. So we're in agreement there, anyways.
Okay.
The illustrations from elsewhere are not to compare crowd control tactics to one municipality or another, but it's to illustrate what happens when crowd violence goes unchecked and people lose confidence in the fact that the police are going to be able to control crowd violence. I refer specifically to Kenosha, where people put out a call to have others come in to protect their property, and that resulted in death and shootings and significant problems for them. So it's not a compare and contrast of ways to do things. It's an illustration of what happens when police fail to or are perceived to have failed to control the crowd violence. So that was my point to that, just to clarify.
Thank you. So now we're going to go in order of arrival. The questions can be to any one of our panelists and to the co-sponsors. Again, with Councilor Arroyo having a hard stop at 12. So if anyone has questions specifically for him, they should lead off with that. Councilor Flynn. Just check. He may have actually, I know people had so many meetings. Councilor Flynn may have, okay, I see he had to go. My apologies. Councilor Bach may have also.
Madam Chair, I was actually just going to say, no, I've been here, but I have an 11:30 that I need to go to. So
right on time.
But I would thank everybody for the testimony and just say that I would love if when the specific suggestions shared by the ACLU are shared with the chair, if you could just circulate them to all of us so that we have those. I was sort of trying to track them in my head, but it's always useful to have it down on paper. And then I would just echo your urging to BPD to think about what their sort of counter proposal would be here, because obviously I don't think, for me, I share very much your view that this is something that we should be codifying in a way that we know that we're protecting people consistently. As important as goodwill is, that we're not relying on it legislatively. So yes, those are just my comments, and no questions at this time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Braden.
I also like to see the ACLU document. I come to this, I have my baggage. I come from Northern Ireland, where 120,000 kinetic impact weapons were discharged. It's 15 fatalities and hundreds of very seriously injured people with long-term disabilities. So I really would love to get a place that we can codify this, and that the use of these weapons would be really essentially a last resort, and that, you know, I don't want to see sort of creep in practice. That it becomes sort of the norm that they're used without very careful consideration. So I really encourage everyone to come to a wording that is acceptable, and encourage the BPD to really work with us to try and come up with language that will codify this, the use of these weapons, and make it safer. Thank you. I don't have any further questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Janey. Oh,
I'm good.
Okay. Okay. Councillor Mejia.
Yes. So in the interest of brevity, just going to ask 2 questions, and more of a statement in one instance. This ordinance doesn't seem to outright ban the use of chemical agents, and if we're not able to do that, can we create some sort of dashboard where we could see how much and how often the BPD uses these materials, so that there's a way for us to have some sense of accountability that is public and that we can monitor and track? That would be helpful. And for those who have been impacted either physically or mentally, how can we use this ordinance to provide justice for peaceful protesters who just so happen to be in the way of tear gas and rubber bullets in the past? So I'm just curious about what that will look like. And then I just want to go on record to say that I'm in fully support of banning these tools outright, and they're not used in war or in prisons, but for whatever reason, residents who are speaking out against injustice are punished with sometimes permanent damage by tear gas and rubber bullets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone wanted to answer the 2 questions?
The ordinance, if I may, the ordinance does deal with civil actions for injuries caused by this. It says that any person injured or harmed by a violation of the ordinance can bring an action seeking damages and attorney's fees and other relief. And if they are harmed by this, they'll be entitled to recover damages and attorney's fees in a civil action, including a treble damages penalty for that.
Thank you. Yeah, for clarity, does that also include mental and emotional, or just physical?
Any kind of damage. Yep.
Oh.
So it would include mental or emotional damage as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
The other, just to interpret or to direct the question, Councillor Mejia, the dashboard question that you had, I think that would be better served to the co-sponsors if that's something they're willing to put into the language in terms of research, analytical, and records keeping requirements.
I think I can sort of speak to that, because I wouldn't restrict that kind of a dashboard just to, I think there should be a use of force dashboard. I think every time they use force, whether it's a hand, a baton, excuse me, my voice is leaving me, any sort of force, that should be in the dashboard. And I know that BPD sent us all, I think about 10 or 15 minutes before this hearing, their records, I think for like the last 7 years of use of force, which I haven't obviously had a chance to dig through and go through. But I think if they keep those records should be public without having to make a public records request. Those should be public facing. We should have that kind of dashboard. It's not in here. I'm happy to figure out if there's a way to put that in here, but I wouldn't want it restricted just to uses of this. I would want it to encompass every use of force as the department records it themselves.
Yeah, and to that vein, to the co-sponsors through the chair, I guess that's how we logistically do this, is also advocate that, and I don't know, it's not, I think it would be helpful for us to have an understanding of when use of force is happening, not just under protesting circumstances, but at all, in any type of police interaction. And I mean, that might be a little bit extra, but I do think that there is some benefit of really having a deep dive and an understanding in terms for more of an accountability perspective of how often these things are happening, just so that the public could be well aware. Obviously we're the ones who are paying for these toys anyway, so we should be able to have some way of keeping tabs to how these toys are being used.
I'll just quickly add on the public safety dashboard piece, which has been in conversation for years, to have the department reveal critical information around their diversity numbers, their spending, et cetera. That continues to be just a policing reform point that we keep pushing and wanting to have, which of course would include this. Definitely the points that Councilor Mejia raised, definitely the points that Councilor Arroyo raised, because the lack of transparency is a problem. And we've heard that from various folks. And so this is sort of incorporated into that. And so I agree with Councilor Arroyo, but I do think we don't want to limit it to just this. There are separate conversations happening with respect to the creation of a public safety dashboard. So I just wanted to add that.
I think the mayor and the police commissioner have agreed to a dashboard development under the existing reforms that were announced last month.
So Councilor Mejia, you have our commitment from my office, or from my from as chair of government ops, for us to compare the commitment made by the mayor with what you're asking for, to see if it covers what you're talking about. And if not, Councilor Campbell, go ahead.
Front and center on this, we've been talking about the public safety dashboard for years, including just the basic inclusion of the number of Black and brown and the racial breakdowns and gender breakdowns of our sworn officers. And that's taken years to do. It's great that we have this commitment from the task force to do this post George Floyd. So I want to be very candid. So include some things, but it doesn't include other things. And so there's an opportunity almost similar to the Civilian Review Board to include it, to make sure it's as expansive as possible. And so that is a separate conversation that's ongoing, and we should absolutely, whether it's a public safety committee, government ops committee, ways and means committee, to be at the table with respect to those developments.
So maybe the conversation on this, and this is a great conversation, Councilor Mejia, thank you so much. To the co-sponsors, is this something you think should be, it might be bigger than the ordinance in terms of the data collection, and it might be bigger in terms of we need a separate one, which is fine. It's not a question. It's not a bad thing if we need a separate one. I
would defer to Councilor Campbell on this, who I know has been dealing with these issues for longer. But to me, that sounds like a separate ordinance to get that dashboard collection. But I would defer to my co-sponsor on this, Councilor Campbell. I know she's been the chair of public safety, and she's been on this for a longer time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think we necessarily need an ordinance, right? We've been talking about, we just need that commitment, which we have through the task force and the administration, which is a really good thing. And of course, Commissioner Gross and leadership at BPD. Now the question is what's going to be included on that public safety dashboard, and there are a whole host of ideas. I know of some commitments from the administration. I don't think I have quite yet an expansive view of what they want to include, but this is definitely one of the things they should include. And that's been on the table for a while, along with a whole host of other issues or sort of data points that many folks and advocates have been wanting to see for a long time. So we have an opportunity, and I think we will continue that on a separate thread.
Could I ask one more question, Councilor Edwards? I'm just curious if there's a way for us, and I think I mentioned this in August, that, there's some officers who have some mental, emotional issues, but they're deployed oftentimes to protest just because of, we might have a limited force. I don't know why, but I'm just wondering if this is an opportunity for us to really be super mindful in terms of who are the folks that we're deploying into these protests, and ensuring that if they're going to make any decisions in terms of whether or not they're going to use tear gas, that we are vetting folks who can do that. And I don't know if that's worth mentioning here or even considering, but to the co-sponsors of this, I'm just really curious about the mental and emotional well-being of some of these officers who are in the front lines of these protests, deploying these rubber bullets and things of that nature. So I'm just curious if this is a conversation worth having in this space.
I would say from the police department perspective, we have a very engaged and respected peer support unit, and any one of our supervisors or peers at any level could engage with them if they have concerns about a particular officer, and certainly any officer that's experiencing some kind of difficulty could engage them on their own. There's numerous opportunities, and we do have outstanding supervision, outstanding sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and command staff that know their people and do their best to recognize if there are any types of interventions that may be needed. So it's an ongoing process. Obviously, it's in the context of a crowd control situation, have that conversation, but that's obviously something that we want to be aware of on a day-to-day basis, to know our people and know that they're in the proper fitness for the duties that they are going to have to undertake, especially in this climate where there's a lot of negativity towards police officers at all levels of society and government. So yeah, that's a potential issue, and that's certainly one that we've been on top of and remain on top of with our excellent staff at the peer support unit. So thank you for your concern.
Thank you. Do you have a running list of officers who you are monitoring, and is there a list somewhere where you say, well, these particular officers should not be deployed to certain protests just because they've been known to have aggression and things of that nature? Is that something that you have at your disposal and readily available in terms of information?
Well, I don't think we're using the peer support unit as a punitive measure like that, and I don't think that there's necessarily any psychological review for people that whether they can perform a particular function or not. Rather, we do what most public and private sector employers do with their people and with their staff that are crucial, to include, the medical people in the COVID situation are under a lot of stress as well. It's designed to where people can be confident in the process, that they can get help and that they can be fit to perform their functions as needed. So no, not to my knowledge. We don't keep a running list of people who seek help from the peer support unit. I think that would be counterproductive and probably would violate some of the professional obligations of people that staff that unit. However, as I mentioned, we do have engaged supervisors at every level that are certainly well capable of noticing any problems that someone might be having, and they're fully within their rights to raise those duty status determinations within the department, and we make the appropriate adjustments as needed.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you everyone for being here today. So some of the conversation that I'm interested in that I think Councilor Edwards brought up was a look at what other cities are doing, especially cities that are similar to ours. I'm most curious about any analysis of changes like this, and these are pretty significant changes in policies and procedures, what impacts that has had on those cities in particular. If we can analyze sort of what's happening within crowds, what's happening at both rallies and demonstrations and protests, and I think there's a difference between some of those activities, and the response of local police departments, sort of those impacts. I don't know if anyone's looked at that or if there is any analysis yet at this point to look at that. I don't know if Jeff is preparing to unmute or.
I know, Jeff probably has more on this, but Seattle and most recently Philadelphia are the two recent, and those are both this year. And so I don't know that there's going to be much from those. But Jeff, I don't know if you got something else.
Yeah, Rashawn is right. There's not a lot of information of that. In the letter that was sent to the mayor and city council members on October 20th of this year, this is a letter from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights, and Human Rights First. They wrote that in 125 separate incidents in 40 states and the District of Columbia between May 26th and June 5th of this year, There was 125 documented incidents of police using excessive force against protesters, including misusing tear gas, pepper spray, and inappropriately and indiscriminately firing less lethal projectiles against protesters. And then between May 26th and July 27th of this year, Physicians for Human Rights documented 115 cases where kinetic impact projectiles were fired against protesters, resulting in serious injuries.
So I do know that letter, I think vaguely, or a letter similar to that. I made a note to make sure that I pull that up. My question is really, when we've had these bans or strict restrictions around certain uses, is there an analysis, or has there been an analysis around what has happened? So what's occurred afterwards, both positive and negative? How has that impacted both policing and sort of the activities among, again, rallies, demonstrations, and protests?
As far as I know, no, there hasn't been. I am on a national listserv from around the country for the National Lawyers Guild. And as I said, there hasn't been, other than Minneapolis, there hasn't been a permanent ban on these passed. And there is no analysis that I'm aware of about what's happened in Minneapolis since the ban was passed, which was only a few months ago.
Right, right. And then what about, one of my concerns is we are disarming the police from some tools and leaving them with very few tools, which the service weapon and themselves. Are there other protocols, other tools, other pieces of equipment that would replace the use of, whether it's the kinetics or the chemicals?
Well, again, this is not a ban on the use of them.
Right.
This is only putting in place some guidelines for when they will be used appropriately. And it allows the police, in fact, to actually use all of these weapons when it's appropriate to do so. But we want the higher officials, we want people like Deputy Superintendent McGoldrick to be making those decisions, not individual police officers using their own discretion. That's exactly the kind of thing that leads to these injuries and the misuse of these weapons and the indiscriminate use of them. There is no attempt at all to take these away from the police and say you can never use them. That's not what's occurring. So there is no need for another set of weapons to be put in their place, because they can use these weapons when it's appropriate.
I don't know if Deputy McGoldrick came on camera. I'm not sure if he had a response or.
Yeah, I would say there really is nothing else out there. I mean, this is something that's been adopted and used. These, the kinetic weapons have developed over time, and we use them, as I said, one time in my career at a crowd control situation. The type that we're using now, the sponge round. It's safe and effective, but not without risk, certainly. As far as OC and CS, again, very sparingly have they been used. But beyond that, I mean, those are kind of what's built into some of the crowd control training when it gets to the point where it's a violent crowd that's committing acts of violence within the crowd and against others. There's no great solution that takes the place of that. I wish there were. I wish there was an extremely low risk, low liability option that would prevent violence. If that's developed, we'd certainly want to adopt it. There's always new products coming on the law enforcement market, but there's obviously significant risk in being an early adopter of those. We saw those with the early adopters of tasers before they became a refined product that's much more safe and effective now than when it first hit the market. So even if new technologies and new tactics are developed, there's a risk at being an early adopter of those. And so we would have to very carefully weigh how we adjust proven tactics that have mitigated some violent actions.
So just so I understand, there's that ban in Minneapolis. Are there other cities that have incorporated and used this policy with the additional protocols in place prior to use?
As far as I know, no. Again, Denver has the court order restricting them. Seattle did have a ban, but that was a temporary ban, and the city council there is working on that.
Mhm.
I also know that, because I'm working with them now, the city council in Cambridge and the city council in Somerville are considering similar ordinances to the one being proposed here in Boston.
And no larger cities, some more similar in size to Boston. What's happening in New York? You know, granted, obviously New York's much bigger than us, but when we think about the boroughs and some of the city centers across, are they looking at any of these restrictions in New York?
As far as I know, they are, but none have been passed.
Mhm.
The only one that's been passed is the one in Minneapolis. And again, that's a complete ban.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Councilor Sabi George. I think of the folks who are attending, I'm the only one left with any questions. And at this point, I really don't have any additional questions for the panelists. It's about 10 minutes to 12, and I'm feeling myself. I'm doing back to my 2 hours of getting hearings and working sessions done. I'm feeling myself. I'm not gonna lie, I'm bragging. Yes, I am getting this done in time. But with the remaining 10 minutes, I mean, I have, for me, what I'm walking away going to do is probably research the court order that Jeff brought up. If there is somebody in Denver to contact, I'm going to still contact them to see what can be found out about the implementation or the reaction, or just doing some research in general. I'm curious. Denver is about kind of the same size, I feel, as Boston. Maybe I'm wrong. We compared it in terms of size when it came to our cannabis ordinance, so maybe I'm wrong.
No, Denver is very similar to Boston.
Okay. So I think, I mean, while they would have, this year, May or March, something, they won't have much, I think it's still worth doing some initial research, and I can work with co-sponsors on that as well. And in terms of the language from the ACLU, I will absolutely send that out to everybody to look at. And again, I really do hope there is some protocol that the BPDA can lead on, even if it is nationally, lead on and say, this is something that we are comfortable with. It doesn't have to be what we're proposing, but something that you are comfortable with would be more than ideal. It would be an incredible, I think, olive branch to demonstrate where you guys, even if you're codifying what you do anyway, but it would mean a lot. So those are my concluding remarks. I will check with the co-sponsors about finalizing the language and possibly having this voted on this year, though we have very few sessions left. If it is not, then it's a matter of just perfecting the language and having the co-sponsors reintroduce it early next year. And then it could easily also be voted on then. So this is, we have a clock, we have time. It's going to very likely be put before the body, I'll say. I can't say if it's passed or not because my colleagues have to vote on it, but it's likely to be put before the body. So I really hope there's partnership in what we put before.
We certainly,
Chairwoman,
look forward to working with you.
Chairwoman, I can send the, there was another court order. It was not in Seattle, it was in Portland as well. And I can send both of those federal court orders to Councilman Arroyo, and he could distribute them to the council. There's one from Denver and there's one from Portland.
If you could CC me as just Councilor Arroyo as the committee chair for government ops, if you could just CC me on those things.
Absolutely.
Jeff, I don't know if you said anything. Did you thumbs up it? Okay, thank you. And then Deputy Superintendent, you were saying something.
No, I was just following up on your comments, and we do look forward to working with the council to add our input to this. And if our input can be helpful in developing something, then we're certainly glad to continue the engagement in this process.
Thank you very much. So I am going to go ahead and close out this working session unless somebody absolutely has something they need to say right now. I think, you know, normally in a hearing, we have everyone do concluding remarks, but this is not a hearing, it's a working session. So with that, thank you all for attending today. We will follow up with any documents we receive and any research. Have a good day.